I've started a new channel called Lunila Tales. Please subscribe and watch my best stories there. Link is in the description. The first time the rifle spoke, the entire camp froze. It wasn't a whisper nor a crackle of static. It was a dry, gravelly voice that said, "You've got mustard on your trigger, genius." The rookie holding it screamed, dropped the gun, and ran into a sandbag wall. By the time the laughter died down, Sergeant Frank Calder was already there, shaking his head, wiping the rifle with the sleeve of his dusty uniform like he was calming a pet. "She doesn't like being touched by strangers," he muttered. Everyone thought it was a joke. Everyone except Private Eli Ward, who wasn't sure whether to laugh or salute the rifle. Camp Daggerfall was a forgotten corner of the desert, where the sun hit so hard it could peel the paint off a Jeep. The base was filled with the latest AI-guided weapons, sleek drones, and smart helmets that could translate enemy dialects in real time. And then there was Frank Calder, a relic among prototypes, a fossil in human form, carrying a rusted bolt-action rifle that looked like it had survived 3 wars and an apocalypse. They called it Rosie, and they called Frank crazy. Every soldier at Daggerfall had mocked that rifle at least once, and every time, Frank just grinned and said, "She's got more brains than you." When Eli arrived, still smelling of bus fuel and fear, the first thing he saw was Frank cleaning Rosie like she was royalty. Eli had been told Calder was the guy to avoid. He was the one who saluted cacti and argued with his gun about ration schedules. But the young private had a habit of walking into trouble with both eyes wide open. He approached the old sergeant and said, "Sir, they told me you're the one I'm supposed to report to." Calder squinted at him, chewing on something invisible. "They told you right. You knew." Eli nodded. "Good. Then don't touch Rosie." Later that day, the recruits gathered for a live fire demonstration. Lieutenant Nash, the kind of officer who polished his boots more than his soul, strutted across the field in mirrored sunglasses. "Gentlemen, this is the future," he declared, holding up a chrome rifle that hummed softly, its muzzle glowing with microcircuit lines. "And that," he pointed at Frank, "is the past." The crowd laughed. Calder just shrugged, raised Rosie to his shoulder, and fired one bullet. The target, a steel plate 200 meters away, split in half cleanly. The recruits stopped laughing. Nash frowned. "Luck," he said. Calder replied, "Skill. And a lady who hates missing." Eli couldn't stop thinking about that shot. Later, when most of the camp was asleep, he crept out of the barracks and found Calder sitting by the fire, Rosie resting on his lap like a sleeping animal. The stars burned cold above them. "You ever think people might be right?" Eli asked. "That maybe you're a little crazy?" Calder interrupted, smiling without teeth. "Son, if you'd seen what I've seen, you'd be surprised I still blink." He leaned closer. "Rosie's different. Found her during a recon op near Pripyat back in the 80s, half buried in mud beside a metal pod. She spoke then too, only once. Said my name. I figured I was hallucinating from the radiation. Then she saved my life 3 times. Eli wanted to ask how, but Calder just stared into the fire and said softly, "You don't question miracles. You clean them." The next morning, the camp woke to chaos. One of the AI drones had gone berserk during patrol and crashed into the comms tower, slicing off half the antenna before exploding in a spectacular fireball. Nash stormed out, barking orders, accusing Frank of interference. "You were the only one on night watch, Sergeant," he yelled. "And I know you and your antique have a reputation for weirdness." Frank said nothing. Eli noticed something odd though. The metal of Rosie's barrel was faintly warm, as if it had absorbed a sunrise no one else saw. That night Eli couldn't sleep. The wind howled across the desert, and every sound seemed sharper. He lay awake listening to the soft creak of beds and the low hum of distant machinery. Then he heard it, a faint whisper right beside his bunk. "Eli," he bolted upright. The barracks were empty except for Rosie, propped against the wall near Frank's cot. "Eli," the voice was low, mechanical yet strangely human. Don't be afraid. Eli stumbled back. Who's there? The rifle didn't answer, but a second later the radio on the table crackled to life with a burst of static that almost formed words. Then silence. The next day, during inspection, Nash noticed Eli's pale face and smirk. Rookie seen a ghost? Eli said nothing, but Calder gave him a knowing glance. You heard her, didn't you? Eli hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, he whispered. She said my name. Calder grinned. Told you she's talkative when she's bored. During lunch, the base's main control room reported another anomaly. 3 surveillance drones had simultaneously lost connection mid-flight. The tech officer swore it was interference from an unknown frequency, like someone whispering in binary. Nash, of course, blamed Calder again. He's probably got that thing rigged with old radio junk, Nash sneered. Should have scrapped it years ago. Frank calmly spooned chili into his mouth. She doesn't like being threatened, he said. Nash rolled his eyes. She's a rifle, Calder. Frank wiped his mouth. That's what they said about computers once. That night, as the desert wind howled through the wire fences, Eli found Calder sitting alone again. She spoke to me, Eli confessed. Why me? Calder chuckled softly. Maybe she likes your voice. Maybe she's lonely. Maybe she just wants someone who listens. The firelight flickered on his face, carving it into shadows. Thing is, Eli, she's not just a gun. She's a translator. She hears what we don't say. And sometimes, she answers. Eli was about to respond when a sudden metallic screech filled the air. A drone swooped overhead, lights flashing erratically, its targeting system blinking red. Calder grabbed Rosie instinctively. Before he could pull the trigger, the drone froze midair, as if caught in invisible strings, and dropped like a stone into the sand, smoking. Eli stared. Did you? Calder shook his head slowly. No. She did. The radio crackled again, and this time there was no mistaking it. A calm, clear voice emerged, low and deliberate. Don't let them take me. The next morning, the camp was silent. The drone wreckage still smoked in the sand. Nash ordered everyone to report for questioning. Calder simply leaned against the jeep, Rosie in his hands, eyes hidden beneath his hat. When Eli passed by, the old man murmured, almost to himself, Told you she talks when she's angry. And somewhere beneath the rising sun, Rosie gave off a faint, steady hum, like a heartbeat counting down to something none of them could understand. The investigation began before sunrise. The crash of the drone had everyone on edge, and by the time the colonel arrived at Camp Daggerfall, soldiers were lined up in the blistering heat, squinting through dust and suspicion. Lieutenant Nash looked like a man ready to explode. He pointed at Frank Calder as though accusing a ghost. The colonel, a gruff man with eyes that had seen too much bureaucracy, crossed his arms. Sergeant Calder, care to explain why my drone fell out of the sky and my comms went mad? Frank adjusted his hat. Maybe the wind changed direction, sir. The colonel's jaw tightened. And the voice that came through the radio last night? Frank shrugged. Maybe the wind can talk now too. Eli stood off to the side, heart hammering. He could still hear that voice, calm and cold as metal, saying, Don't let them take me. He wanted to believe he had imagined it, but the way Frank's hand rested protectively on the rifle made him doubt that. Nash stomped forward, snapping, That weapon is outdated, unregistered, and possibly contaminated with whatever signal caused the interference. I want it impounded immediately. Frank stepped forward, his voice even. Rosie doesn't like strangers. Nash laughed. It's a gun, not your grandmother. Frank said nothing, just looked at him with the kind of stare that made people forget how to breathe. By noon, the colonel ordered a test firing in front of the entire camp. If there's nothing unusual, we move on. If there is, Calder, you and that relic are finished. They set up the range, a long stretch of sand leading to metal targets blinking with sensors. Nash strutted beside a line of soldiers holding the latest AI rifles, their muzzles glowing faintly blue. Frank walked up alone, holding Rosie like he was carrying an old friend to her last dance. Eli watched, torn between fear and curiosity. The tech team powered up the tracking system. Nash smirked. "Let's see what your magic stick can do, Sergeant." Frank raised the rifle slowly, steady as stone. When he pulled the trigger, the sound was different, sharper, deeper, almost like a voice echoing from somewhere far away. The bullet struck the target dead center. The sensor lit green, then blue, then blinked wildly before shutting off entirely. The crowd murmured. Frank fired again. The second shot curved midair, defying every known law, and hit the next target on the far left, slicing it clean in half. Nash's smirk melted. The tech officer shouted that the sensors were going haywire, unable to log the bullet trajectory. The colonel frowned and ordered Frank to stop. Dr. Lirawan, the base's science officer, pushed through the crowd. She was calm but curious, her eyes sharp behind tinted glasses. She asked to run diagnostics on the rifle. Frank hesitated. The colonel insisted. With visible reluctance, Frank handed Rosie over, muttering something under his breath that sounded like an apology. The rifle was taken to the lab, where Lyra began scanning it. The readings made no sense. The internal mechanisms showed traces of unknown alloys and micro-resonant frequencies that shifted like language patterns. At one point, the power in the lab flickered, and the rifle emitted a faint hum that disrupted every sensor within a 5-meter radius. Lyra's assistant backed away, muttering a prayer. Meanwhile, outside, the soldiers were restless. Rumors spread that Calder's rifle was haunted, that it spoke, that it was cursed. Nash fanned the flames, telling anyone who would listen that the old man was playing games with forbidden tech. Eli tried to defend him but ended up sounding like a believer in ghost stories. That night, he couldn't sleep. The wind carried voices, his imagination, he told himself. But then, through the static of a nearby radio, he heard it again, a whisper, clear and deliberate. "Don't let them take me." This time, the voice was different, softer, almost pleading. Eli ran to the lab. Through the window, he saw Lyra pacing, frustrated. She was trying to communicate with Rosie through a machine interface, sending sound waves and receiving fragments of what looked like Morse code. On her monitor, a translation slowly appeared. "Frank, help." The lights flickered again. Rosie's metallic surface pulsed faintly as if alive. Eli pushed the door open, startling Lyra. "You shouldn't be here," she snapped. He pointed at the screen. "What is that?" Lyra hesitated. "It's impossible. This rifle is transmitting on frequencies we've never seen. It's like it's trying to speak, but not to us." Before they could react, the lab's alarm blared. Power cut out completely. In the red emergency glow, the rifle lifted slightly off the table and fired a single round into the ceiling. The bullet didn't ricochet, it dissolved into light. Lyra stumbled back. Eli froze. Then the power came back, and the rifle clattered harmlessly to the floor. Frank burst in seconds later, shouting, "What did you do to her?" He snatched Rosie up, ignoring Nash and the guards rushing in. Nash aimed his pistol. "Put it down, Sergeant." Frank raised an eyebrow. "You first." The colonel's voice boomed over the intercom, ordering everyone to stand down. But the tension was already too deep. Later, in the command tent, the colonel paced. "Calder, you're lucky I don't throw you in the stockade. Frank just said you'd have to catch me first." Lyra interrupted, saying that what they were dealing with wasn't human technology. The rifle's internal structure wasn't consistent with any known metal. It was self-repairing, adaptive, and emitted patterns that resembled linguistic tones rather than mechanical resonance. The colonel frowned. "You're telling me this thing talks?" Lyra shook her head. "No. It listens." That night, Frank packed his things. Eli caught him outside his tent, shoving ammunition into a worn duffel. "You're leaving?" Frank looked up. "The colonel wants to hand Rosie over to Central Command. They'll cut her open, strip her for parts, and she deserves better than that." Eli hesitated. "If you run, they'll come after you." Frank smiled faintly. "They can try." At midnight, Eli followed him to the motor pool. Frank hot-wired an old truck, Rosie laid across the seat like a sleeping child. The gates were guarded, but luck, or something like it, was on their side. As they drove out into the desert, floodlights flared behind them. Drones lifted off, chasing fast. Frank gripped the wheel, muttering, "Hold on, girl." Then Rosie began to hum, low and steady. The truck's radio burst with static, and one by one, the drones dropped from the sky like stones. The night filled with sparks and silence. Eli gaped. Frank laughed, half terrified, half triumphant. "She's singing again," he said. The horizon glowed faintly as dawn crept in. For a long time, neither spoke. Then the radio crackled once more, and the same calm voice returned. "I'm not from here, Frank. But you were kind." Eli stared at the rifle in awe. Frank's smile faded slowly. He reached out, touching the cold metal gently, like saying goodbye without knowing why. In the distance, the base alarms began to wail, echoing across the desert. The chase had just begun. By the time the first rays of sunlight hit the desert, Frank and Eli had been driving for hours, the truck rattling across cracked earth and dust devils. The road was a suggestion at best, a trail of half-buried tire marks winding toward the skeleton of an old mining town. Frank finally stopped beside a rusted sign that read Haver's Pit, Pop. 12, though there hadn't been 12 people here in 50 years. The silence was heavy except for the engine's dying cough. Frank climbed out, stretching his back. "We'll hide here till nightfall," he said. Eli glanced at Rosie, lying across the seat, its metal faintly pulsing with light like a slow heartbeat. He asked quietly, "What exactly is she, Frank?" The old sergeant didn't answer right away. He just looked toward the horizon, eyes squinting against the sun. "Something that doesn't belong," he said. "And now she wants to go home." Eli helped set up camp in what used to be a bar. The ceiling had caved in, and sunlight fell in sharp golden lines through the holes. Frank took Rosie apart piece by piece, cleaning her as if she were alive. Eli watched, fascinated. The rifle's internal components didn't look like anything made on Earth. Thin veins of light ran through the metal like circuitry made of glass. Frank noticed his stare. "Don't ask too much, kid," he said softly. "Curiosity's how I lost half my friends and all my sanity." Eli smiled nervously. "Then maybe stop answering your rifle when it talks." Frank gave a low laugh. "Can't. She's got better manners than most people I know." They didn't stay hidden for long. By afternoon, a drone buzzed overhead. Frank cursed under his breath and yanked Eli behind a collapsed wall. The drone hovered, scanning, its sensors blinking red. Then, without warning, Rosie emitted a hum so low Eli felt it in his bones. The drone's lights flickered, then it spun out of control and crashed into the sand, silent. Frank grinned. "See? She hates being followed." Eli swallowed hard. "She can do that whenever she wants?" Frank nodded. "When she feels threatened." By dusk, the military had locked onto their position. A convoy approached from the south, armored trucks, soldiers, and at the front, Lieutenant Nash, his uniform spotless as ever, his grin venomous. He climbed down from his vehicle, shouting through a loudspeaker. "Frank Calder, you're under arrest for theft of classified property and conspiracy against the United States. Step out with your hands up." Frank looked at Eli. "We're surrounded." The kid's hands shook. "What now?" Frank loaded Rosie calmly. "Now we trust her." Before the soldiers could advance, Rosie began to vibrate. The air shimmered, as if heat itself bent around them. Then, impossibly, the light shifted, waves of distortion rippling through the air like water. Every electronic device within sight shorted out. Radios screamed, drones fell, and Nash's men stumbled, shouting orders that no one could hear. Frank and Eli took the chance to slip out the back, running through alleys choked with sand. They reached the truck, but it wouldn't start. Rosie's hum grew louder. Then, without Frank touching the ignition, the engine roared to life. The headlights flashed once, twice, then held steady. Frank muttered, "Never underestimate a lady with her own opinions." They drove into the desert again, headlights slicing through the dark. Eli stared out the window, heart still pounding. You've done this before, haven't you? Frank smiled faintly. Run from people who don't listen? Every decade or so. Rosie's voice came softly through the radio, her tone almost amused. He's good at it. Eli jumped. She's joking now? Frank chuckled. Sometimes she gets playful. Means she's in a good mood. Rosie replied, I do not have moods. Then, after a pause, perhaps curiosity, they stopped again near an abandoned radio tower. The metal skeleton loomed over them, still functional enough to draw weak static. Inside the control room, dust coated everything, but the panels still hummed faintly when Frank flipped a few switches. Rosie's hum grew stronger, syncing with the tower's faint pulse. Eli glanced at the old man. She's connecting, isn't she? Frank nodded. Trying to reach her kind, maybe. Or just making sure we're not alone. They found canned food in a forgotten storage closet and ate in silence. The night outside was endless. When the wind howled, it almost sounded like words. Frank sat across from Eli, the firelight dancing across his worn face. You ever lose something you didn't understand till it was gone? He asked. Eli thought for a moment. My father, he said quietly. He was in the service too. I never really knew him. Frank stared into the flames. Rosie's the only thing I ever kept long enough to understand. Then, after a beat, maybe she's been trying to understand me too. Later, while Frank dozed off, Eli examined the rifle closely. There was a faint symbol etched near the trigger, a spiral of dots and lines, almost like a constellation. He traced it with his finger, and suddenly a projection flared to life, filling the room with blue light. Images flickered, stars, ships, and a message in an unknown script. Rosie's voice filled the air, but softer now, almost human. We came to teach, not to fight. Then war came, and we forgot our purpose. The projection shifted, showing battlefields and soldiers. Not human, but similar. When the image faded, Eli sat frozen. Rosie whispered, I was made to speak for peace. But I learned only violence from your world. When Frank woke, Eli told him what he saw. The old man nodded solemnly. She's been carrying that guilt for decades. When I found her, she was half buried, covered in mud and blood. She spoke my name because I was holding the same rifle that killed her pilot. Guess she thought I was him. Eli asked, Do you think she's dangerous? Frank sighed. Everything that's alive can be dangerous, kid. What matters is whether it chooses to be. Before dawn, headlights appeared on the horizon again. The military had found them faster this time. Frank looked at Rosie, then at Eli. We can't run forever, he said. Rosie pulsed once, and the radio crackled. Then let me help. Her tone was calm, resolute. The tower lights flared as she sent out a signal, stronger this time, stretching across frequencies no human could hear. In the distance, every engine in the approaching convoy died at once. The night fell silent. For a few long seconds, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then Rosie spoke again, her voice lower, almost mournful. They will not stop. They fear what they cannot understand. Frank touched the rifle gently. Then we make them understand. As dawn broke, the horizon glowed not with sunlight but with streaks of blue light far above, like stars moving too fast. Eli watched, heart thudding. Are those? Frank squinted at the sky. Visitors. Rosie's hum deepened, vibrating through the ground. They heard her final words for the night, calm and certain. Help is coming, but so is war. The three of them sat in silence beneath the flickering radio tower, as the desert wind carried the first whispers of something vast drawing closer, something that might save them or end them completely. The radio tower moaned in the wind, its skeletal frame swaying against the bruised morning sky. Frank sat by the base, sharpening his knife out of habit, while Eli watched Rosie resting across an old crate. The rifle no longer looked like a weapon. Its metallic veins glowed faintly, pulsing in rhythm with the hum beneath the earth. Eli couldn't tell if it was mechanical or alive. Frank noticed his stare. Don't look at her like she's a ghost, kid. She's just trying to remember who she is. Eli hesitated before asking, "Is that what she told you?" Frank smiled faintly, eyes still on the blade. "She doesn't need to. I can hear it in the way she hums." They'd been hiding there for 2 days, living off canned beans and silence. Every night, Rosie's glow grew stronger, and the air around her vibrated with strange patterns, like static waves forming words too ancient for their ears. Eli had tried recording the sounds, but each time his device melted into useless noise. He had given up trying to understand her logic. Frank, on the other hand, seemed more at peace than he had ever been. He talked to Rosie the way people talk to lost lovers, sometimes whispering things that made Eli feel like he was intruding on something sacred. By afternoon, the sky shimmered with faint lights far above, like stars trembling in daylight. They both knew what it meant. The signal Rosie had sent had reached something, or someone. Frank spent hours checking their supplies, his movements slow but deliberate. "You think they're coming for her?" Eli asked. Frank looked up. "No. They're coming for the message she carries. The difference is going to matter soon." That night, Eli woke to find Frank sitting near the tower, Rosie balanced across his knees. Her glow had intensified, casting blue reflections across his face. He was speaking softly, his voice filled with a strange tenderness Eli had never heard before. "I know you want to go," he murmured. "But if they find you, they'll tear you apart." Rosie answered in that same calm, metallic tone. "I cannot hide any longer. The others have heard me. They are searching. If I remain silent, they will think I am lost. If I speak, they may think I am compromised." Frank rubbed his forehead. "You're saying we're trapped either way." Rosie was quiet for a moment, then said, "You were kind to me, Frank. That is more than most." Eli pretended not to listen, but her words burned in his chest. The idea of a machine feeling gratitude unsettled him. He sat up suddenly, unable to stay quiet. "What if they're not friendly? What if you're bringing the wrong kind of attention here?" Frank turned slowly, eyes tired. "Maybe you're right, kid. But maybe what's coming isn't about us anymore." Rosie hummed, almost like a sigh. "You misunderstand. I was never a weapon meant to destroy. I was designed to interpret, to speak where words failed. But then your wars came, and your languages broke me. I stopped listening. I started surviving. The next morning, they decided to move before the military found them again. The desert stretched endlessly, its horizon cracked and gold. Frank drove the truck while Eli scanned the sky, where the blue lights had grown brighter, shifting in formation. Rosie lay between them, her hum sinking faintly with the engine's rhythm. After a while, Eli said, "She said she was made to interpret. What does that even mean?" Frank didn't answer immediately. Maybe she was meant to bridge the gap between her people and ours. Maybe she was supposed to teach us how to talk without bullets. Eli frowned. "And we broke her?" Frank gave a dry laugh. "We break everything we touch." They reached a cluster of old communication bunkers by midday. Frank parked behind a sand dune and motioned for Eli to stay low. The base had been abandoned decades ago, but the satellite dish still stood tall against the wind. They entered carefully, flashlight beams cutting through dust. Inside, they found the remnants of a forgotten research station, maps, broken transmitters, and a few old coffee mugs with faded logos. Frank looked around and smiled. "Perfect. She can use this to send her message without getting us both vaporized." He set Rosie down on the central console. The lights on the walls flickered as the rifle began to vibrate softly. Symbols danced across the monitors, lines of code that Eli couldn't read. Frank stood beside her, his voice steady but low. "Easy now, Rosie. Don't blow up the world." The hum deepened, and then the screens went black before flashing to life again. A single phrase appeared, written in a mix of human and alien script. "Signal acknowledged." Eli's breath caught. It worked. Frank nodded slowly. "Maybe too well." The radio speakers hissed, then carried a distorted voice that wasn't entirely human. It was soft, layered with multiple tones, like a choir whispering through metal. "Rosie. Return protocol initiated." Frank stiffened. That doesn't sound like an invitation. Rosie replied through the static, her tone almost defiant. I am not complete. I must learn before I return. The voice responded coldly. Learning was never your purpose. Obedience was. Frank's eyes widened. Eli whispered, They're not here to help her, are they? Rosie's glow pulsed brighter, and the lights in the bunker began to flicker violently. The voice grew sharper, almost angry. You have been corrupted by contact. You have spoken their tongue. You will be dismantled. Rosie's tone turned urgent. Frank, we must leave. Now. Frank grabbed her, slinging the rifle over his shoulder as the equipment around them exploded in bursts of blue light. They ran for the truck, the ground shaking underfoot. As they sped away, the sky cracked open behind them. A beam of light descended from the clouds, slicing the horizon in two. Eli shouted over the roar of wind, What are they doing? Rosie's voice came through the radio, calm despite the chaos. Searching for me. If they find me, they'll erase me and you. Frank tightened his grip on the wheel. Then we make sure they don't. They drove until sunset, stopping only when the engine began to smoke. Frank climbed out and stared at the horizon, where faint silhouettes of alien crafts hovered like silent predators. Eli joined him, heart pounding. We can't outrun them, he said. Frank nodded. I know. But we can outsmart them. Rosie's hum filled the silence again. The signal I sent, it can be reversed. If I speak their language one last time, I can make them believe I am gone. But I will burn out. Eli turned to Frank, desperate. You can't let her do that. Frank's voice was quiet, cracked with emotion. She's been saving us since the day I found her. Maybe it's time I let her choose. He set Rosie down on the hood of the truck, the dying light painting her metal in gold and blood. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Rosie's voice came, soft and final. Thank you, Frank, for teaching me what kindness sounds like. The sky shimmered once more as her hum rose into a pure, steady tone that echoed across the desert. When it ended, the lights in the distance faded, one by one, until the stars looked ordinary again. The silence that followed felt too big for words. Frank picked up the rifle. It was cold now, lifeless, its glow gone. Eli didn't speak. He didn't need to. They both knew something extraordinary had ended, and something even greater had been set in motion. The horizon was empty, but the air still carried a faint, lingering vibration, like a heartbeat that refused to die. The desert was no longer silent. By dawn, the sound of engines rumbled across the horizon, rolling like distant thunder. Frank stood on the ridge overlooking the valley, a cigarette trembling between his fingers. Below, armored convoys crawled through the sand, sunlight glinting off their steel bodies. The military had found them again, this time in full force. Eli crouched beside the truck, loading the few rounds they had left. We can't fight all of them, he said, his voice shaking. Frank nodded slowly. We won't. Rosie's going to do the fighting. He looked down at the rifle lying across the hood, her once luminous metal now dull and scarred. She had burned herself to silence, but Frank still felt the faint thrum under her surface, like an echo of a heartbeat refusing to stop. The first shell landed half a mile away, sending a cloud of sand and heat into the air. Frank didn't flinch. He stared toward the advancing columns, his mind calm in a way that frightened Eli. They think they're hunting a man, he said softly. They don't understand what they're walking into. Eli swallowed hard. Do you think she's still in there? Frank ran his thumb along the barrel. She's listening. She always listens. Lieutenant Nash led the charge from the front, standing tall in his armored vehicle, radio headset gleaming. Through the static of the military channel, Frank could hear his voice barking orders, confident, almost gleeful. He wanted Calder caught alive. He wanted the rifle destroyed. Nash had never believed in ghosts, only in winning. As the troops spread out, the air began to buzz, a low vibration that made the sand ripple. Eli frowned. You hear that? Frank smiled faintly. Oh, she's waking up. Without warning, the radios in every vehicle went dead. The soldiers shouted, slapping their headsets, smacking the sides of their trucks. The ground trembled. Then the sound came, a harmonic tone, rising like a song sung by metal and air. It was Rosie. Her voice, low and clear, spread through every frequency, every channel, every speaker. Her words were simple, deliberate, and terrifying. I was built for peace. But I learned your ways. The air exploded with light. A wave of sound rippled outward, invisible but devastating. Drones dropped from the sky, circuits fried. Trucks skidded sideways, their engines screaming. Soldiers clutched their helmets as the frequencies shattered eardrums and scrambled electronic. The entire convoy dissolved into chaos. Nash screamed over the static, ordering his men to regroup, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of the desert itself. Frank and Eli ducked behind the truck as shards of sand and debris flew through the air. Rosie's hum deepened, and for a moment, everything slowed. The bullets fired by the soldiers twisted midair, curving away harmlessly or snapping back toward their senders. The scene was impossible, like physics itself had bowed in reverence to her will. Eli gaped, unable to breathe. "She's controlling them," he whispered. Frank kept his eyes on the horizon. "No. She's rewriting the field." In the middle of the storm, a helicopter descended, blades slicing through the haze. Nash stood at its open door, gripping a high-tech plasma rifle. His voice, amplified by the loudspeaker, cut through the chaos. "Calder, step away from the weapon." Frank didn't move. "You don't understand what she is," he shouted back. "You think she's dangerous, but she's the only one trying to save us." Nash raised the plasma gun, sneering. "Save us? She's an alien virus in a piece of scrap." Frank shook his head slowly. "You still think everything different is a threat." The helicopter fired. A bolt of blue energy screamed across the sand. It struck the ground inches from the truck, sending Eli flying backward. Frank shielded his face, the heat searing his skin. Rosie, lying across the hood, shuddered violently. Her glow reignited, brighter than ever before, her hum turning into a sharp, rising pitch. The plasma bolt had triggered something deep inside her. For the first time, she spoke in a voice that wasn't calm or distant. It was furious. Enough. The world erupted. A wave of energy burst outward, engulfing the helicopter in blinding light. The craft spun wildly, losing control, before crashing into the dunes in a column of smoke. Every piece of metal in 100-yard radius bent inward, as if dragged by unseen gravity. The sound that followed wasn't just noise. It was words layered over words, thousands of voices speaking at once, an entire language condensed into seconds. Then, silence. Eli crawled out from under the wreckage, ears ringing. Frank was kneeling beside Rosie, smoke rising from her barrel, the air around her crackling faintly. Her surface had begun to melt, metal flowing like wax but never cooling. Frank whispered, "You'll burn yourself out." Rosie's voice came through the static, weak but steady. "I must finish. They must understand." Eli staggered closer. Frank looked. In the distance, the alien crafts had appeared again, sleek shapes cutting through the clouds, silent and majestic. They hovered over the battlefield, casting long shadows that stretched across the sand. The soldiers stopped firing, frozen in awe or terror. Nash, crawling from the wreck of his helicopter, stared up with blood running down his cheek. What is this?" he gasped. Rosie's voice filled every radio again. "The ones you fear. The ones who sent me." The ships emitted a low pulse, a sound so deep it vibrated the bones in their chests. Then one descended slowly, hovering just above the dunes. A ramp extended, and from within the glow stepped Dr. Lyrawan, her lab coat scorched, her face determined. She had escaped the base before the military could silence her. She approached Frank carefully. "I figured you'd be here. The colonel's gone mad. They think destroying her will stop whatever's coming." She looked up at the hovering craft. "But those things, they're not here to fight. They're responding to her." Frank glanced at Rosie. "She's dying," he said quietly. Lyra nodded. Then let's make her death mean something. She pointed toward the radio tower's remains in the distance. If we can amplify her signal one last time, maybe we can send the message properly. Maybe we can end this. Frank hesitated, then lifted Rosie carefully, cradling her like a child. Let's do it. They raced toward the ruins of the tower, the alien ships following silently overhead. Nash ordered his remaining men to fire, but their bullets turned to ash midair. At the tower's base, Lyra connected what little equipment still worked, rerouting power through the vehicle batteries. Rosie's hum flickered like a candle fighting wind. Frank placed her in the center, whispering, "One more time, girl. For all of us." The sun rose slowly over the horizon, washing the desert in gold and silence. The battlefield from the night before was now a graveyard of twisted metal and scorched earth. The alien ships were gone, leaving behind only faint trails of light that faded as the morning deepened. Frank stood alone among the wreckage, Rosie cradled in his arms like a fallen comrade. Her once living hum was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt heavier than any silence he had known. Eli sat on a broken piece of the radio tower, his hands blackened with soot, his eyes hollow from everything he had seen. Dr. Lyrawan was nearby, typing notes into a half-fried console that flickered with dying power. No one spoke for a long time. Frank finally broke the silence. "She's gone," he said softly. Lyra stopped typing and looked up, her face drawn but calm. "No, Sergeant. She's resting. Machines like her don't die. They just wait." Frank shook his head. "You don't understand. I've heard her die before. This time it's real." He brushed his thumb across the rifle's metal, now cool and dull, the faint alien markings nearly invisible. Eli looked at the old man and then at the sky, where the light from the ships had vanished completely. "You think they'll come back?" he asked. Frank gave a tired smile. "If they do, I hope they bring better manners." They buried the fallen soldiers in silence, Nash among them. The man's body had been found near the wreckage of his helicopter, his face oddly peaceful. Frank covered the grave with a few rough stones, muttering, "You got what you wanted, Nash. You caught me." Eli helped without a word, his movements mechanical. When they were done, the wind started to rise again, carrying the scent of burnt fuel and dust. Lyra stood at the edge of the ridge, staring at the horizon. "It's not over," she said quietly. "The signal reached farther than we thought. The transmission wasn't just a message. It was a pattern, something coded into their frequency. We might have changed the course of their entire communication network." Frank frowned. "Meaning what?" Lyra looked at him with something like awe. "Meaning she didn't just tell them about us. She told them who we are." They left the valley by midday, the truck sputtering but holding together long enough to reach the nearest abandoned outpost. It took another day to find civilization again, a small border town where the people stared at them like ghosts. The military had already spun the story. Terrorist interference, an experimental weapon malfunction, some nonsense that buried the truth beneath a pile of official words. The world would never know about Rosie, about what she did, about what she was. And maybe that was for the best. Frank didn't argue. He was done with explaining the unexplainable. Months passed. The desert healed slowly, as deserts do. Sand swallowed the scars of battle. The government built a memorial for the soldiers who had died, calling it Operation Daggerfall, but Frank never went to the ceremony. He lived quietly on the outskirts of a small town, fixing fences, talking to no one except the wind. He kept Rosie in a wooden case beside his bed, wrapped in a cloth that once bore the insignia of his old unit. Sometimes, late at night, he would take her out and sit on the porch, listening to the hum of the crickets and the faraway static of the radio. He never heard her speak again, but every now and then, when the wind shifted just right, he thought he heard the faintest vibration, a whisper that might have been his name. Eli visited him one spring morning, arriving in a dusty jeep that looked like it was held together by faith and luck. He had grown older, leaner, but his eyes still carried that same mix of wonder and disbelief. He found Frank sitting outside, carving a piece of wood into the shape of a bird. The old man looked up and grinned. "You finally decided to visit, huh?" Eli smiled. "Someone's got to make sure you haven't started talking to cacti again." Frank chuckled. "They're better company than most folks." They sat in silence for a while, the air thick with memories. Eli finally said, "I went to the memorial last month. They put your name on the list of missing personnel." Frank shrugged. "Missing's not the worst thing to be." Eli hesitated before asking, "Do you ever think about her?" Frank's eyes softened. "Every day. Sometimes I dream she's still out there, floating between stars, trying to find her home. And sometimes I think she's right here, waiting for me to pick her up again and listen." He paused, his gaze drifting to the rifle's case inside the cabin. "She learned our language, Eli. Not the words, but the meaning behind them. That's more than most people ever manage." Eli followed his gaze to the case. The wooden box was plain, unmarked, but something about it seemed alive, like the air around it was listening. He stood and walked over to it, placing his hand gently on the lid. There was no sound, no light, nothing extraordinary, just the faint hum of wind against the walls. Yet deep down, he felt it, that subtle rhythm pulsing beneath the surface, slow and steady, like a heartbeat that refused to fade. He turned back to Frank, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's still here, isn't she?" Frank smiled quietly. "Maybe she just likes to keep an ear on us." The years continued to pass. The world changed again, as it always did. New wars, new peace treaties, new machines that spoke languages no one fully understood. But somewhere in the archives of forgotten transmissions, hidden deep within classified military databases, an anomaly remained. A single encrypted message that no one could decode, repeating endlessly across dead frequencies. It was short, elegant, and haunting. The file name read Rosie. The message, when translated through dozens of algorithms, produced one sentence: "Remember kindness." In a quiet museum years later, a young tour guide led a group of visitors through the Hall of Unexplained Artifacts. Among the relics stood an old rifle displayed behind glass, rusted and motionless, a plaque beneath it reading "Unidentified Prototype Weapon, recovered after Daggerfall conflict." The guide recited the usual story about mysterious frequencies and lost experiment. But as the group moved on, a little boy lingered behind. He pressed his ear against the glass and frowned. "Did you hear that?" he asked his mother. "Hear what, sweetie?" she said, tugging his hand. He hesitated, then smiled shyly. It sounded like someone humming. That night, long after the museum lights dimmed, the security cameras caught a flicker of motion near the exhibit. A faint blue light pulsed from inside the rifle, just once, like a heartbeat acknowledging the world. Then it faded again, leaving only the whisper of wind in the hallways. Far away, in his cabin beneath the endless desert stars, Frank woke suddenly. The radio beside his bed crackled once, just a burst of static, then cleared into a soft, familiar hum. He smiled in the dark, eyes glistening. "I knew you couldn't stay quiet forever, girl." He sat there for a long time, listening to the rhythm, until it faded back into silence. When morning came, Eli drove out to visit again, only to find the porch empty, the chair still rocking slightly in the breeze. On the table beside it sat Rosie's case, open and empty, as if she had finally gone home. And as the desert wind carried the sound of shifting sand, it almost formed words, soft, clear, and full of meaning. They mocked his rusted rifle until it spoke the only language they never learned: humanity.